Yeah, I will say the one thing this film is not is subtle, which is one of its like amusing traits, in that it's talking about very real things, as most of our films end up doing. But we're talking about vampires versus the Bronx in our history corner today, and there, as I said, not so subtle call outs of gentrification, redlining, and white people's long history of erasing black history, black and brown people's history. So what we see in Vampire in the Bronx is another example of white people sucking the life and culture out of BIPOC communities.
Get it?
Yeah, because they're vampires. You know what vampires are generally? Very pale, like me, unfortunately. Yeah. But here we are. Many have heard of gentrification before because it's like every magazine and newspaper headline about cities, because it's like, yay, gentrification, or oh no, gentrification for the ones that are like more aware of what it actually is. So we're going to give a little like overview of what that is, what it stems from, and like what has been happening across the United States for a long time. So if you haven't heard of gentrification, well, you're late, but also it's basically generally used, it's like as well-to-do white people invade already established POC and BOPOC communities and save them by bringing in hipster stores dedicated to selling random non-essential items like butter or typewriters at exorbitant prices. And essentially as real estate developers going in, buying out the entire area and changing it with this like real gross white savior complexy time that's totally like hypocritical and like a euphemism, because that's not what they're doing. They're just buying out well-established communities, their businesses, and making it like I guess like taking places that were once redlined and turning them into like what redline is defined as is basically like not safe for white people, is what like the maps did. So they're making them safe for white people and like basically sucking them and all of their culture and like positive things out of those communities through buyouts and pricing outs.
More safe spaces.
It's like the United States isn't built around white supremacy or something. It's like everywhere is safe for white, but we have to take every space, apparently. But yeah, happy notes. There are lots of things that influence this, and it's often seen in neighborhoods that were previously redlined, because redlining legally now is illegal, which is what happened with I think the Fair Housing Act in like the 1960s. But that's like recent. So if you don't know what redlining is, it's the systemic denial of various services or goods by federal government agencies, local government, or private sector, either directly or through the selective raising of prices. This is often manifested by placing strict criteria on specific services and goods that are often disadvantaging poor and minority communities, which I pulled from Wikipedia. Essentially, areas where Black families and other POC groups lived were deemed dangerous and on maps were outlined with red lines, and basically were considered unlivable or unsafe for white people to do business. Now those places are being targeted by big real estate companies. We see this in Philadelphia, around the Temple area. We see it in South Philly with Ori Feibush and his little OCF Realty, and other just like big real estate companies going into communities like Fishtown, Southwest Philly. We have like West Philly in general, and then we have like North Philly, all kind of being invaded by these real estate companies claiming like they make big donations to schools and stuff, but then they just like totally price out the communities that live and go to those schools. So like, does it equal out? No.
Well, even some of the schools are at fault, like Temple being an alum, like they had a lot of pushback because they were trying to build their stadium, and it ended up like, you know, trying to buy entire neighborhoods in North Philadelphia. And like that, even like I visited North Philly, you know, recently, and it has changed even more drastically from when I went years ago, like as a student, like it, and then it was already different at that time. So it's just like, imagine what it'll look like in a few years. And if there is a stadium there, like that community is gone, is erased.
Yeah. And it kind of ties into this defamation of like Black and brown people's characters through the press. It like
Mm-hmm.
they kind of tie in hand. So you have big real estate companies like partnering essentially with press and like local newspapers and big newspapers to make it seem like these areas need gentrification. They need their properties bought out because there's nothing but violence and drugs and like other just like oftentimes not true things. And if there are some of those things, it's like blown up out of proportion. Like any little incident is a big situation. And they kind of partner to make these areas like they just defame like Black culture and like lots of Hispanic communities or Asian communities, especially in like South Philly. That's like something that happens all the time where they try to encourage like people from outside the city. So you had like the white flight back in the day. Now they're all coming back to Philly and trying to go to their neighborhood school because it's better than going to the private schools because they now realize like that it was inherently racist to not go to your neighborhood school. So now they are, but like the catch-22 is then they're starting as like groups to fund and influence the school through their money, which basically just like makes the school what they want it to be and does not consider the Black and brown families that go to the school generally. There are positive things that come out of it. Sometimes you get like new schoolyards and things like that. But it's like those things should have already been financial investments by the community. It shouldn't just be because these white people came in and just like rich people. It's like a class issue as well. Came in and were like, we need our schools to be nicer for my kids. It's like they should have been nicer in the first place. We shouldn't have libraries with books from the like 20s.
It should be nice for all the kids.
Yes. And it should have been like, and also a lot of schools have like really strong community like investments. Like there have really strong community bases and like cultural strongholds for these communities. And then like they get whitewashed by these like new people coming in because like the financial backing generally is through the gentrification end and it's gross. But there are positive things that happen because like schools getting more financial things is positive. But if it's only benefiting certain groups, then it's like obviously like putting those groups in bad places. And for context, I worked in the Philadelphia school district for like 5 years. So
yeah,
I know some
and I work in public access. It's like we both know what's going on in these communities. But so not to speak from experience.
Yeah. Not to just talk about Philly, though, because Vampires versus Bronx happens in New York. And New York has a super long history, as well as most of this country, as it is deeply rooted in racism and white supremacy. So in an article titled The Death of the Black Utopia, which I pulled from a video that Gabe shared with me, which I definitely had seen before, but it was one of the articles linked in the video, basically talking about the erasure of Seneca Village, which is in New York and used to exist where like Central Park was, like before Central Park existed, essentially. There's like the west end of Central Park that used to have like a strong Black community that was totally just like erased. And this article is written by Brent Staples. And as he kind of goes on, he claims that there's this historical embrace of willful amnesia around this specific area when it comes to the erasure of Black communities in New York City. He's specifically referring to Seneca Village, an epicenter of Black political power in Manhattan during the mid-19th century, a community that was destroyed through intentional evictions of over 1,600 people who lived on the land designated to become Central Park's west edge. Despite the established community filled with schools, homes, businesses, and more real estate interests, and the press set the state basically intentional removal, and they use the press to like defame this community and make it seem like no one lived there, or like racism played a part in basically like saying that like because Black people live there, it didn't need to exist. It didn't need to be saved. And the act, despite the fact that it was published in the press, was very well documented. But 15 years later, it was kind of like everyone forgot. They found like 2 bodies in there. And they were like, why is there a Black person buried in Central Park? This is so strange. It's almost like a whole community used to be here and it was erased.
Yeah, and they like covered it up to be like, oh, we're making this green space. Like everyone loves Central Park, and totally just and it is like the whole of like what gentrification is, right? It's just like we're like fixing this place, right? Like we're giving them a garden, we're giving them yoga studios. Like this is all for the betterment of the community, forgetting like whose community is this better for?
Yes.
And like when you're pushing out the people who are here, that's not helping anyone. And the reason why I thought of that video was because there's like a line in the film that literally like they say like we chose the Bronx because no one will even know that you're gone. Like no one will notice. And I was like, that's exactly Seneca Village. No one noticed. Like what else don't we know? Like Tulsa, we don't know.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. And I mean, it's something that is kind of like historically present in all of American history, is like the willful amnesia on like the end of white people that has like cut Black achievements out of history for years. As you said, Tulsa, like Juneteenth, other intentional erasures of Black history, news of this like isn't shocking, but it's angering that like people are doing this. So this is something that's not unique to Seneca Village, and is something that real estate developers have tried to do countless times to Black and brown communities across New York City, along with just like defamation in the press to justify the acts. There's a long history of racially motivated domestic terrorism acts against Black communities by white citizens. So I recommend reading the article and watching the YouTube video, because I can only give some of my history section to this, and it should get like an entire, it probably has books. There's probably books.
Yeah,
like
definitely.
dedicated to this. So definitely read it. This is something that took place like in the late 1800s. So it is really just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to New York City's long history of erasing Black communities. And this country has a trend of intentionally segregating and disenfranchising Black and POC communities for white benefit, and that history extends into current times. So, happy. What does this have to do with
about
vampires,
like
Bronx?
Right now with COVID and the pandemic, and the fact that so many are unemployed and unable to go to work for risks, or just that those jobs aren't available anymore. Those aren't even feasible. And so like the fact that we don't have, supports or things in place to protect people. And so it is becoming easier to erase entire neighborhoods now, like, and to buy them out and just kick. Where do they go? No one cares.
Because people people are just so financially strained too, like worse, like as bad as I think as the Great Depression. So yeah, exactly. It's easier to take people out because they're even more like facing hardship than they were previously.
Yeah, and it's one out of like a million things happening right now. So it's so easy to like not even notice.
Yeah, no, that's totally true. So what does this have to do with vampires in the Bronx? There are countless call-outs of gentrification throughout the film that are so on the nose, it made researching this episode pretty easy. So gentrification stems from segregation, redlining, and the erasure of POC communities. Now, redlining did not end until 1968. Yay, I was right when I said it earlier. Look at my brain. When the Fair Housing Bill was passed, redlining laws were still actively hurting these communities. And I read another article titled "Redlining was banned 50 years ago, but it's still hurting minorities today" by Tracy Jan. And there was a study done by the National Community Reinvestment Coalition that shows the vast majority of neighborhoods marked hazardous in red ink on maps drawn by the Federal Homeowners Loan Corp from 1935 to 1939 are today much more likely than any other areas to be comprised of lower income minority residents. The article goes on to quote another member of the NCRC, Jason Richardson. It's as if some of these places have been trapped in the past, locking neighborhoods into concentrated poverty. So these neighborhoods are mostly comprised of African Americans, Catholics, Jewish people, and immigrants from Asia and South Europe. They are deemed undesirable, in quotes. As a researcher from the NCRC named Bruce Mitchell described it, anyone who was not Northern European white was considered a detraction from the value in the area. So when they started doing redlining, areas that kind of come to mind, Flint, Michigan is one of them, famously known for today still having unclean water. And there are many other areas that became populated by minority groups and low-income residents after middle-class white flight took place, moving white people to the suburbs and out of the cities. There's another study in Baltimore, 2015 study of home and small business lendings found that race more than income impacted mortgage lending in the city. Lending was greater in neighborhoods with larger white populations and banks making more than twice as many mortgages loans to whites than Black Americans. So while gentrification increased the income level of previously redlined communities and decreased the segregation between white and Black Americans, there was increase in economic inequality between newcomers and those who historically lived there. So I saw that a lot in Philadelphia, in that like you had areas that like had all these new people moving in who, because of privilege and white supremacy, had significantly more money, and were buying houses that were made to look like space houses from Mars for like the most money for no reason. Like, houses do not need to be this much money, especially ones that are like crumbling and don't have like proper plumbing and are made of like cardboard,
paper.
And look like they're from space. So they were buying these like crazy expensive houses, and like these businesses were coming in and like buying out the neighborhood, basically making it so the rent would go up just so much. And it's like they're trying to make Philly like New York, and New York already has so many problems. Like, no, don't try to make Philly New York. It's not the same. But also, like, the whole process that's been taking place in New York.
Big city. Like, no, can't do that.
And like the only reason New York's rent prices are as high as they are is because of what has been happening for so long with this gentrification process, with this like outpricing neighborhoods and making things expensive for no reason. I mean, if you think of money, it's a construct. Nothing has to cost as much as it is. It's literally supply and demand. So these real estate companies are faking this demand, you know, like they're raising prices specifically with the goal of, one, making money, which understandable, I guess, in a capitalistic society, but specifically to outprice the people who already live there, because they can still consider them, despite they can't do redlining anymore because it is illegal. They still consider them as a detraction from the value of the community. So they're able to do this through gentrification because basically they go in and just take out everything that makes the neighborhood like what it was. And they try to transform it, and they use the press to make it seem like this needs to be transformed, when the transformation is just making these spaces like white and empty, and basically like outpricing all the people who've lived there for years. So there, in the article, it kind of says, rent increases make it possible for longtime residents in these communities to remain in the area, make it impossible for them to remain in the area. So the man who spoke before, Mitchell, who I previously quoted, said, is gentrification promoting sustainable desegregation, or is it just a movement towards increased segregation in the next census period? Which I would argue yes, because if we're living in a white supremacist-based country that is economically motivated by that, you're basically going to push those people out, and it's going to continue to create segregation between Black and brown families with white families. So how I interpret this is white people returning to their colonizing roots by going into communities that previously deemed unlivable and claiming them like safe spaces for them that they need more of, and saving the people who live there, who can't live there for however long because they end up getting priced out. So the reality is they're actively hurting the communities that they've been hurting for hundreds of years, while simultaneously claiming to be their savior, aka white privilege, and aka messed up. And it's largely what this film is trying to call out, similar to like, we kind of get this like really on the nose version of it, and it's definitely hokey, but what it's saying is very real and very true. If anything, the main vampire masquerading as an ally is like a really key indicator of that, pretending to care about the communities that they're in while also like actively like destroying them. Like, there's no real love of the communities. There's like this fake, like, look at me, be woke, I'm gonna go help these kids. And it's like, really, I'm only helping them so that I can take them out later. And honestly, I've met countless women like the main character, the main vampire in this film, who basically would like come into schools and be like, we need this for this so that they're competitive. It's like, but like, you're not listening to any of the people who've been here for like 40 years, essentially. Like, they're just coming in wanting their like white stuff all up in these schools. And they're like putting money behind it to get the principals on their side. And it's gross.
Yeah.
That's my rant. But I wrote up a whole blog on this. So if I was talking really fast and you have no idea what I was saying, I recommend checking it out because you can just read it. And I did a lot of research. I have a lot of links. I did not quote every single link that I read. So I recommend reading them yourself because they're great. And we need to like take care of people and not push them out of where they are. Like if we're going to push people into an area and be like, no one can be here, like don't take those places too. Like let people get a foothold somewhere.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know. It's the whole time, man.
Yes, it is the whole time. Thank you, Kat, for History Corner.
Thanks.